Here we are at the M.Ar.H Chapel at San Lorenzo in Florence. This is a view from within the scarsella looking across the altar. The chapel was designed and built by Michelangelo in the 1520s. In the foreground, at the corners of the altar, stand two elaborate marble candeliers or candlestick bases. We're going to examine the one on the right. Despite its modest scale and the context of the chapel, it reveals remarkable insights into Michelangelo's sculptural working methods. I have found evidence that suggests ancient and Renaissance sculptors began their compositions by first working them out on another surface, paper or parchment, that had already been prepared with the circle grid pattern. That same pattern was then transferred to the marble block. The evidence suggests they inscribed these grids onto the surface of the block using mason's compasses, and in many cases the evidence is still visible today, especially on unfinished works. For example, there are Roman sarcophagi in the Metropolitan Museum in New York that retain traces of these circle grids on their unfinished back surfaces, and these patterns perfectly track the forms, clearly derived from arrays of circles, sculpted in relief on the completed front and sides. Some of these and other examples will be the focus of future videos, including this striking ancient Greek sarcophagus in the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna. Michelangelo's unfinished sculptures in the Accademia Museum in Florence, the so-called prisoners or slaves, also offer extraordinary evidence. Once you know what to look for, you can see the circle grids lightly etched into the marble, aligning with partially emerging limbs and anatomical details. These grids provided a roadmap for transitioning in Michelangelo's sculpting process, which was akin to excavating, from one side of the original block to the next to find and release the figure from the marble. Shown here is the so-called Atlas prisoner or slave. You can see the circle grid scratched onto the back surface in the photo on the right. The deep cuts you can see are not veins or irregularities in the block's surface. They follow large diameters, which also align with the partially sculpted leg on the adjacent side in the left photo. Michelangelo has begun excavating the back surface to find and release the side profile of that same leg. Smaller diameters also align with the partially completed anatomical details on the front. This small architectural object, known as a candelier or candlestick base, was sculpted by Michelangelo for the M.Ar.H Chapel. Modest in scale, symmetrical and simple in composition, it's an ideal introductory example. The circle grid armature governs the relative proportions and inspired compositional form. Because of its scale and clarity, the alignments are relatively easy to detect. And it shows that even in minor commissions, Michelangelo was relying on the same harmonic principles that guided his larger works. Here it is, from the volutes at the top, in the form of ram's heads, down to the rectangular base. Michelangelo sculpted the entire candelier from one block of marble, but we'll start this analysis with that simple base. Here's the base. The shallow relief within the central panel depicts a dragon, with a clamshell motif above, flanked on either side by sculpted lion's paws that form the supports for the upper part of the candelier. Here's the largest diameter on the base, a half circle that spans the full width. The proportions of the base itself, a square in plan, with 4 vertical faces in a 1:2 proportion, are clearly governed by this foundational circle. With this layer, we already begin to see visual alignment between the arcs and key elements in the relief itself, including the dragon's lower neck, extended leg, midsection, and tail. Michelangelo and his assistants undoubtedly cut the marble block down as wide and as deep as the completed base, since no part of the candelier above projects beyond those dimensions. Once the marble block was cut to size, they would have inscribed the preliminary circle grid pattern on its outer surface with a mason's compass or divider. These scratched arcs were functional guides for positioning and proportion as the carving process began. The outer band that now frames the relief likely represents the surface of the original block. And if you look closely, you can still see the ghost of that original circle grid. Fine scratches left on the marble even after filing and polishing. In fact, you can detect tiny indentations or wear marks where a compass point may have been repeatedly pressed to swing arcs from that same center. As the sculptor carved deeper into the marble, the grid would have been reapplied on the inner surfaces, layer by layer, to keep the work aligned with preliminary drawings. Here's the second layer. Two circles side by side across the base, corresponding perfectly with the overall proportions and key focal points of the dragon. Its curling neck, the midpoint of its back, and the center of its tail. The edges or contours of many of these larger features follow circles that the sculptor initially scratched and then drilled into the surface of the marble, leaving marks not unlike the trails of holes left by Michelangelo's compass attachment on the Ashmolean drawing and Last Judgment fresco. Here and there you can still see the telltale signs, sometimes suggesting that they drilled a little too deep. Look closely at the middle of the dragon and you can still make out the trails of drill holes. The 1/4 circle grid captures more detailed elements: the precise contours of the dragon's wings, the curve of its belly, and the outer radius of the spiraling tail. This smallest subdivision is 1/8 the primary diameter. At this scale, even more key sculptural forms align: the dragon's open jaw, fangs, what is either a curling beard or tongue, the inner diameter of its neck, the arcs of the wings, the underside of its belly, and the smaller diameter within the spiraling tail all align with great precision. Even details such as the lobes of the shell motif and the articulation of the lion's paws align perfectly with the circle grid. Here, all the layers are combined, revealing a complete harmonious relationship between the geometric pattern and every major contour of the sculpted base. Now we zoom out to consider the entire candelier. While the base is rectangular, the upper section presents complex double curvatures, the overall form swelling outward convexly in the form of acanthus leaves from the lion's feet just above the base, and then back inwards concavely up to the ram's head's volutes at the top. Here's the candelier from the rectangular base to the volutes at the top, with the primary circle grid overlaid. This largest diameter, which as we have seen matches the proportions of the base, continues upward and hits key compositional elements. The top of the first complete circle, for example, cuts right through the gaping mouth of a monster face, mostly hidden behind a swag draped across the center of the piece. That swag hangs between the curling horns on the head of the monster and above the tops of the outward curving acanthus leaves below. Continuing upward, we reach 1.5 circles from the base, landing precisely at the wings of a pair of vulture-like birds perched on an urn that sits squarely on the head of the monster we just noted, such that the whole sequence looks like a layered, stacked totem. Go one more half diameter up, and we hit the top of the second full circle. And that's exactly the center line between the two ram's heads that form the volutes at the top. So again, we're seeing a very precise vertical sequence, structured entirely around the largest diameter, stacked circles that organize the sculptural elements from bottom to top. Here is the second circle grid. As we've already seen, the lower two complete circles set the base of the candelier and the basic form of the dragon motif. Above that, we contract this diameter to 1.5 circles up from the bottom, and that line defines a key transition. It's precisely where the bases of the outward swelling acanthus leaves begin, directly above the lion's feet. That same arc also intersects the top of the shell motif in the center. The top of the second circle cuts right through the center of the gaping mouth of the monster nestled between the acanthus leaves, and the swag, draped between its horns, also follows this diameter, though it sits a half a radius below that line. Another half circle marks the bottom plate of the urn that rests on top of the monster's head. If we continue upward, we see that the third complete circle up from the base aligns with the outspread wings of those vulture-like birds above the urn. And one more circle above that lands directly on the horizontal center line of the ram's head volutes near the top. But perhaps most striking of all, as we look at the entire profile of the candelier, the inward concave sweep in the middle section, above the acanthus leaves and below the volutes, contracts exactly to the width of this circle. In other words, this diameter doesn't just organize horizontal transitions and forms, it also governs the overall taper and curvature of the central sculptural form. Here's the fourth circle grid. We've already seen how this layer governs the fundamental composition of the dragon sculpture on the base. However, look closely. This photo is of another side. The pose of this dragon is different than the one in earlier slides, yet follows the same circle grids with precision. As we move upward, we can see that this diameter precisely defines the shell motif, while the lion's paws are nestled tightly within half circles. A half a circle above the lion's paws, the curves of the acanthus leaves follow these diameters. The central monster, the crown-like urn resting on its head, and the birds perched above all conform to arcs and horizontal subdivisions. Continuing upward, we see another swag, this time hanging from the horns of the ram's head volutes near the top. Not only does this swag follow this diameter, but the ram's heads themselves, including the spiral of their horns, also track these circles with precision. Here we see the two most consequential layers, the primary circle grid and the fourth layer, for a final focused look at how they govern both major and minor forms. And finally, here's the complete circle grid pattern overlaid on the candelier. Every element, from the dragon, the lion's paws on the base, to the ram's horns at the top, align precisely with this recursive binary structure. We now move forward into the early Baroque period with Carravaggio's Basket of Fruit. At first glance, this small still life might appear to be a spontaneous celebration of natural abundance, yet beneath its surface lies a lattice of geometric arcs and circle patterns, almost like a ghostly veil. This structural framework reflects the classical belief that beauty arises from nature's underlying geometry. The true artist reveals not just appearances, but the deeper order of nature. Here, Carravaggio chooses fruit, nature's own emblem of organic growth and ideal proportion. Yet, in his typical fashion, The fruit is already bruising and withering. The result is a subtle memento mori, a meditation on life's harmony shadowed by inevitable decay. Here is the painting with higher contrast. The craquelure network across the surface reveals a striking correspondence with underlying circle grids. Carravaggio probably incised the circle grid patterns into the gesso layer before painting. And over time, as it dried out and shrank, the fragile paint film fractured along these structural lines, preserving a material record of the compositional scaffolding, just like the flaking intonaco plaster and paint we saw in the frescoes in Part 1. Rather than random aging, the paint's cracking patterns reveals a precise geometric framework that shaped the placement and rhythm of the painted forms. Zooming in on the upper left background, an area without figural detail, the craquelure follows regular radii. In some places, perfect circles emerge from the cracking patterns. Some cracks shift from one radius to another exactly at points where two different circle layers intersect tangentially, a strong indication that these radii were pre-inscribed. Here, I've overlaid computer-drafted circles onto the image, making visible the congruence between the cracks and the underlying circle grid. Here, this color-inverted image shifts visual emphasis, making certain arcs and cracks more discernible when toggled with the positive version. Removing hue entirely, the tonal values alone guide our perception. The absence of color can make geometric alignments easier to detect. This inverted grayscale image shifts our perception once again. This is what I call a bas-relief or engraved impression. Using Photoshop, a grayscale image is overlaid with its exact tonal inverse at reduced opacity. A slight shift between the layers produces a shallow bas-relief effect, similar to an engraving. This enhances outlines and background marks, allowing arcs to be traced from a leaf stem through to the background, revealing how the underlying grid extends across the canvas, regardless of the presence of figural forms. In Carravaggio's basket of fruit, the circle grid layers appear to follow a binary sequence: 1, 1/2, 1/4, 1/8, and 1/16. In the following sequence, high contrast color images of the painting are followed by my own freehand tracings, highlighting the most salient compositional and craquelure alignments corresponding to a specific circle grid layer. These are followed by computer-drafted circle grids corresponding to the same diameters. While the diameter of the largest circles are nearly as tall as the painting itself, the pile of fruit is almost entirely contained within the lower half circle, slightly offset to the left of the painting's center axis. To create compositional equilibrium, Carravaggio counterbalances this offset with the projecting twig and cluster of leaves on the right. Several key forms, twigs, the edges and midribs of leaves, and the basket itself track these arcs closely. For instance, that twig that rises from the right edge of the fruit basket, and its leaf hovering over the void between the basket and the larger leaf in the corner, arcs upwards closely following that diameter, crossing over the right edge of the painting near its vertical midpoint. The outer edge of the hovering leaf are concentric with both of those arcs. The midrib of the largest leaf in the painting, just to the left of center, follows one of the primary arcs with striking precision, rising from the center of the basket, swinging upward and leftward along the curve. On the opposite side, a matching arc rises from the same point and swings up to the right, just touching the lower profile of the peach and the upper edge of the leaf below and to the right. The basket itself has a distinctive flare. From where it rests on the table, it curves gently inward, closely following the lowest arcs. It then flares outward, closely aligning with the tangential arc swinging upwards. To the left of the basket, a small leaf near the bottom snaps to a key intersection of primary circles and provides a compositional anchor point. From there, one can trace a continuous arc that rises through another sequence. First, the top of that leaf itself, an adjacent leaf, a cluster of grapes, across the apple, more grapes, and finally a twig that emerges just above the grapes and to the left of the peach, leading our eye to the top center of the fruit pile. Above the center point, my freehand arcs track subtle marks in the craquelure, swinging left and across the upper portions of the composition. Carravaggio wasn't particularly precise in his application of the pattern in those regions. There appear to be multiple imprecise arcs of this largest diameter swinging adjacent to and overlapping one another, suggesting he applied the pattern with haste. The presence of my freehand arcs might also draw your attention to the presence of craquelure patterns that track smaller diameters. The computer-generated circles seen here confirm the alignments seen in my freehand version. This is the second circle grid layer. While the primary circle grid structured the macro composition, this layer helped Carravaggio with mid-level compositional organization. It introduces a denser harmonic field. Smaller arcs and circles nested more closely begin to articulate the internal rhythms of the fruit basket. The central cluster of fruit just below the midpoint of the composition is contained by a dominant circle centered on that axis. Below it, three overlapping circles, left, center, and right, run across the base of the basket, defining it and the horizontal spread of its contents. Together, this group of four circles forms a subtle armature, organizing the composition at this scale. The fruit and leaves seem lightly cradled within these circles, not rigidly enclosed, allowing for natural variation, but within a clear structural logic. Along the left edge of the basket, notice how the edges of several leaves land cleanly on those arcs. Above, the midrib and tip of the largest leaf touch the arc, while the veins within that same leaf also align. The midrib of the leaf to the left of center, above the pear and below the large leaf, tracks that diameter perfectly, as does the midrib of the hovering leaf over the void to the right of the basket. Here's the corresponding computer-generated circle grid. Here are my freehand tracings of the fourth circle grid layer. We saw in earlier examples, like the Dionysus mosaic, Raphael's Madonna Enthroned, and Michelangelo's flood scene, that these recursive layers articulate compositional structure at multiple scales: macro, mid-scale, and micro. In those works, the circle grids organized large clusters of figures, which then broke down into individual bodies, primary anatomical components, right down to the diameters of heads and halos, and even to micro-anatomical features like the articulation of arms and legs or the structure of a face. Here, in Carravaggio's still life, we see the same principle applied to natural forms. The pile of fruit, smaller clusters, the individual elements, and their internal contours all respond to these recursive harmonics. Within the basket, the apple stem, twigs, tendrils follow these arcs with surprising consistency. In several cases, the midrib or central vein of a leaf aligns closely with an arc, even when the outer profile deviates. This avoids a mechanical appearance and preserves the organic quality of the forms. Some examples include the cluster of small leaves to the left of the basket, which is nested within a semicircle, and the midrib of the large leaf above precisely follows an arc. These arcs also guide the weaving patterns of the basket itself. And in the background, the craquelure patterns, especially visible in the open fields of paint above and to the sides of the basket, also appear to follow these diameters. My freehand tracings over several of these cracks help draw your attention to how many of them are components of complete circles. And here are the corresponding computer-generated circles. At the scale of the 8th circle grid layer, the alignment and repetition of forms becomes rhythmic. Leaves, grape clusters, the curvature of stems conform so frequently to this diameter that it recalls the ornamental repetition in the border of the Dionysus mosaic or the patterns in Raphael's Madonna Enthroned. And at this scale, it's not just the fruit and leaves that align, but the voids as well. Just as we saw in the Dionysus mosaic, the voids are as carefully choreographed as the fruit itself. The weaving of the basket also bends to the same rhythm. In the background, the craquelure seems to ripple along arcs of this grid. The entire field is vibrating with the same frequency. This recalls a similar phenomenon we saw in the Dionysus mosaic. There, we noted how the tesserae in the seemingly empty background followed faint directional lines, geometric echoes that reinforced the structure even where there was nothing. But there's one key difference. In the mosaic, the background tesserae were laid intentionally to echo the geometry, and that design was always meant to be visible. In Basket of Fruit, by contrast, the craquelure emerged over time, and Carravaggio could not have foreseen how the surface would eventually fracture. We have seen something similar in the various frescoes we've examined. In Giotto's Scrovegni Chapel frescoes and Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel frescoes, intonacoplaster or as secco pigments have flaked or cracked over time, exposing the underlying geometries. Here's the computer overlay confirming the freehand tracings. Here, all binary layers, from the largest to the smallest, are combined over the image, revealing the full harmonic scaffolding of the composition. In this slide, every freehand tracing is superimposed, showing how multiple grid scales interact and nest within one another. And with the painting removed, the tracings alone preserve the recognizable structure of the composition, demonstrating how closely the geometry underlies every element. Here's the complete digital circle grid pattern, which gives an impression of how the gesso layer might have appeared before Carravaggio began painting, albeit more precise than what was possible with compasses and templates. There has been a long-standing debate about how painters of the early modern period achieved such striking naturalism. In 2001, David Hockney famously proposed that artists like Carravaggio and Vermeer used optical devices, particularly the camera obscura, to project real-life scenes onto their canvases, allowing them to trace complex forms with precision. Philip Stedman further supported this theory through detailed reconstructions of Vermeer's interiors. Other scholars, including Martin Kemp, have raised valid doubts, pointing to the lack of direct physical evidence. No surviving lenses, no written documentation, and no unambiguous examples of tracing in the final works. While it's unlikely that Carravaggio would have bothered using a camera obscura for a small still life like basket or fruit, the broader hypothesis is still worth exploring. My proposal is that if Carravaggio, or other masters, used a camera obscura to project an image, especially in larger or more complex compositions that included multiple figures in poses with difficult foreshortening, such optical methods would not have been incompatible with the use of geometric patterns. These two approaches, projection and geometric planning, could have worked in tandem. In this scenario, Carravaggio might have projected the image of the subject onto a panel already prepared with a gesso ground inscribed with a circle grid armature. Then he could have adjusted the position of the canvas relative to the projection, or the arrangement of the figures themselves, to adjust and align key elements with the underlying geometry. The final painting would not be a literal tracing of nature, but a composed and idealized version of it, shaped by both optical observation and a harmonic framework. When so many works of art, spanning centuries, geographies, media, and scale, all bear the imprint of the same compositional system, it becomes increasingly difficult to dismiss the patterns as coincidence. From the ancient Dionysus mosaic to Carravaggio's basket of fruit, we see repeated evidence of recursive circle grids, not just as a single overlay, but in multi-layered, proportionally scaled iterations, where unmistakable alignments can be found at all scales, inspiring composition while regulating proportion. We can categorize the evidence we've seen into 5 categories. 1. Physical but non-aligning marks. These include compass point holes, scored circles and arcs, flaking paint, and craquelure patterns in background areas without visible compositional elements. They suggest that these underlying patterns were applied across the entire surface. 2. Physical and compositional alignment. Here, those same kinds of marks coincide precisely with forms, heads and halos, the arcs that trace the legs in Michelangelo's Ashmolean study, or fresco figures whose outlines follow multiple grid arcs in seamless succession. 3. Overall compositional structure. In many cases, entire clusters of forms, such as the groupings of figures in Michelangelo's Flood and Drunkenness of Noah scenes on the Sistine ceiling, are bound within large circles of the same diameter, recurring across different zones of the same composition. And in that instance, they correspond perfectly with repeating ornamental elements, the repeating pairs of medallions that he painted across the entire ceiling. 4. Ornamental geometry. Decorative patterns, like the motifs in the border of the Dionysus mosaic and the complex quatrefoils in the tapestry of Raphael's Madonna Enthroned, align precisely with multiple circle grid diameters. Variations on the same pattern occur elsewhere in that painting, yet align perfectly to the quatrefoils and the figural composition, suggesting the pattern was applied to the entire surface. 5. Architectural alignment. In monumental works like the Sistine ceiling, the Scrovani chapel, or the School of Athens, these circle grid systems were not arbitrary or self-contained. Their proportions are derived directly from the architectural space. Vaults, bays, and lunettes determined the circle grid, and then the grid guides the composition. In many cases, such as the scenes on the Sistine ceiling, which we only briefly examined, we find all 5 types of evidence. The circle grids appear on small figural studies that perfectly match the fresco when scaled up. They determine ornamental motifs like the repeating bronze medallions. Those same diameters give structure and dimension to key compositional forms like the arc, the inuti, and clusters of figures. Cracks, fallen plaster, and patterns of flaking paint align as well. And the diameters themselves correspond directly to the architecture of the chapel. For these artists, geometry wasn't decorative or optional. It was the foundation of all design, grounded in the belief that nature itself is governed by harmony. From classical antiquity through to the Baroque and beyond, beauty was understood to emerge from this order. In architecture, painting, music, and nature itself. But these principles began to fade with the rise of Romanticism, when artists and architects rejected what they saw as rigid mathematical constraints in favor of intuition, emotion, and individual expression. What the evidence now shows, however, is that for centuries, this geometry was not theoretical. It lies beneath and directly inspired some of the greatest works of Western art.